Welcome. You know, for centuries, there's been this idea of two different days at the end of time. A day of wrath, called the day of the Lord, and a day of blessing, the day of Christ. But what if that's not the whole story? What if the earliest evidence actually points to something completely different? Today, we're diving into a fascinating theological puzzle. Are these 2 days actually just one and the same? Let's investigate.
Now, you might think this sounds like a pretty minor detail, but the answer has huge implications for how we understand some pretty major biblical prophecies. So we're going to treat this like a real investigation, just following the clues and seeing where the evidence takes us.
So, here are the two main camps in this debate. On one side, you have the view that these terms are basically synonyms, just two different names for the exact same event. But on the other side, there's the argument for a really sharp distinction. The day of Christ is all about blessing for believers, while the day of the Lord is all about judgment for the world. So, which view does the evidence actually support?
To solve a puzzle like this, you've got to start at the beginning. So our investigation kicks off by going right back to the source to figure out where this original phrase, the day of the Lord, even came from in the first place.
You see, back in the Old Testament, the day of the Lord, or the day of Yahweh, was a massive concept. This wasn't just any old Tuesday. It was this prophesied moment of powerful, direct divine action. It was a time of impartial judgment on wickedness, for sure. But it was also a time of vindication, where God would step in to set things right and prove his cause was just.
And that, right there, leads us to the crucial question that bridges the Old and New Testaments. If this was originally the day of Yahweh, how on earth did it get so directly connected to Jesus? The answer is a really key piece of our puzzle.
Well, it wasn't some random switch. It was actually a very natural theological development. Just follow the logic here. Step 1. You have the Old Testament prophets all talking about the coming day of the Lord. Step 2. The absolute earliest, most foundational confession of the Christian faith is simply, Jesus is Lord. So step 3 was almost inevitable, right? If Jesus is the Lord, then the day of the Lord must be his day. It just makes sense.
Okay, now it's time to bring in our key witness, the Apostle Paul. His letters are some of our earliest Christian writings, and how he uses these phrases, well, that provides some of the strongest clues in this entire investigation.
And just look at the variety here. This is really telling. Paul doesn't just stick to one single term. He talks about the day of Christ, the day of Jesus Christ, and the day of our Lord Jesus Christ. He seems to use them all interchangeably, which is a pretty huge clue that he saw them as just different ways of saying the exact same thing.
And this gets right to the heart of what Paul's doing theologically. He wasn't just borrowing an old phrase. He was making a profound statement. By applying the day of the Lord directly to Jesus, he was placing Jesus in the very same role that Yahweh held in the Old Testament. For Paul, Jesus is the Lord of that day.
Now, this point is absolutely crucial. For Paul, there wasn't a separate, gentle day of Christ over here and a harsh day of the Lord over there. Nope. All those powerful, dramatic events the Old Testament prophets described, the judgment, the wrath, the setting things right, Paul applied all of it directly to the future coming of Jesus. It's one event.
So we've looked at the linguistic origin and the theology of Paul. But what about some hard proof? Well, now we turn to what I think is the smoking gun of our investigation. A tiny but incredibly powerful clue, hidden away in an ancient manuscript.
The evidence is located in a very specific place, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 2. It's right here that we find something fascinating, something that really pulls back the curtain on how early Christians understood these terms. Okay, check this out. In our earliest and most reliable manuscripts of this verse, Paul warns about the day of the Lord. But in a whole bunch of later manuscripts, a scribe has actually changed the word to the day of the Christ. Now that detail is everything. It shows that the person copying it saw these two terms as so completely synonymous that they felt perfectly free to just swap one for the other. They clearly believed they meant the same thing. All right, so let's step back and connect all the dots. We've traced the evidence from the Old Testament, we've gone through Paul's theology, and we've even looked at a specific textual clue. So what's the final verdict? What does it all mean?
The evidence trail is pretty clear, and it really only points in one direction. First, the language itself shows a natural evolution from the Old Testament. Second, our key witness, the Apostle Paul, treats the terms like they're synonyms. And third, that manuscript evidence, the smoking gun, confirms that early scribes understood them that way too.
So the verdict of our investigation, based on all this evidence, is pretty conclusive.
The day of the Lord and the day of Christ are not two different events. They are two different names for the same single future end times event.
So instead of thinking about them as two totally separate programs on a timeline, one for blessing, one for judgment, the evidence tells us they're actually complementary titles. They're like two facets of the same diamond, describing one ultimate reality, the day that Jesus Christ returns in glory.
And that really leaves us with a final, thought-provoking question, doesn't it?
If the day of Christ and the day of the Lord are truly one and the same, a single event that encompasses both blessing and judgment, both hope and accountability, how does that change our understanding of what it really means for Christ to return?
Something to think about.